wouldn't be here today. I'm thankful to everyone who made this happen tonight. And I'm particularly grateful to Carla Dover for joining me for this. I'm here tonight because I love Kentucky. And I also want to be real with you. I'm also here tonight because often I'm frustrated by Kentucky. Every time I grow weary with our politics, however, I think about what Charles Booker has helped to teach me, that Kentucky is worth fighting for. So I want to talk to you briefly tonight about some of those frustrations, but also some of my hopes, and how voting is one of the major ways we can change this place for the better. I teach at Berea College, and this semester I'm teaching an Appalachian literature class. We move chronologically, beginning with prehistory and ending with the most recent piece of literature I can find for them. We start by looking at what I have identified as the first piece of Appalachian literature, the Judaculla Rock. This is a large sandstone boulder. It's in western North Carolina, and it's covered in over 1,500 Cherokee motifs or petroglyphs. No one knows what these symbols mean, but we know they are the oldest documented writing in Appalachia. They date back about 1,000 years ago. And then we move through as much literature and media as we can in one semester. Right now, we're in the 1990s, and my students just read an excerpt from Kentuckian Bell Hook's remarkable book, Belonging. In the essay called Kentucky is My Fate, Hooks talks about the complexities of being from a place like Kentucky. On one hand, she felt safe and loved in the rural countryside of Christian County, Kentucky, while also witnessing tremendous racism there. She loved roaming the hills and valleys with other children, both black and white, who lived near her. She wrote, quote, "In the hills of my girlhood, white and black folks often lived in a racially integrated environment, with boundaries determined more by chosen territory than race. The hills belonged to everyone. In those hills, there was nowhere I felt I could not roam, nowhere I could not go," end quote. Yet, she lived 10 miles from the largest Confederate monument in the nation, the 351-foot high obelisk that memorializes Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy. And as a black child, she had to constantly see that reminder that so many of the people she lived with supported what it stood for, all the time. But as we know, there is nothing absolute about Kentucky, just as there is nothing absolute about any place. All places are complex. And in that Appalachian Lit class, one of the foundational things we talk about is that we cannot discuss Appalachia, certainly not Kentucky, without having a deep understanding of stereotype. And the thing I drill into my students' head is that complexity is always the opposite of stereotype. I want them to reject absolutism. I don't want them to either wholly embrace the concept of Kentucky any more than I want them to wholly reject it. It is just as unfair to romanticize a place as it is to villainize it. I'm saying all of this as a prelude because I want us to think about why we love Kentucky. It's a huge part of my identity. I feel it in my blood and my bones. When I was a little boy and we would make the rare trip outside of the Commonwealth, as soon as we crossed the state line, I would whoop and holler. I fancied I could feel the border sizzling through me. I was so happy to be back home. I loved it first because I had been taught to love it by my family. I loved it fiercely because I knew that much of the rest of the world hated it. When you are from a place that the whole world teaches you to be ashamed of, you tend to either embrace the shame or you love it more intensely. I always chose love. Yet, it has been rare for years now that I have felt represented properly in the place I love so much. My husband often says that he wants Kentucky to love him as much as he loves it. I agree with that notion. Often, I'm deeply embarrassed, troubled, and even outraged by the positions of many of the people we continue to elect as our representatives. I have seen many of these politicians rail against our foundations and our foundational rights. They have mocked and berated public school teachers. They have narrowed the separation of church and state. They have strived to take away the rights of teachers to teach the true history of slavery and racism in our country, the rights of teachers to teach about the full human experience by acknowledging that LGBTQ people exist and belong in the world. They have pushed to reduce the rights of women's control over their own lives and bodies. They've elevated the rights of corporations and reduced the rights of individuals. And they've endangered our democracy along the way. And that's why we have to get out the vote. I know there are many ways to change Kentucky for better, but one of the major ways we can do that is by voting, by letting others know about why we are voting the way we are, by helping others to get to the polls to vote, by stressing to people why it is so important to use their rights to vote and to not become complacent. I keep meeting all these people who are like, there's nothing to worry about. I know, I'm worried. I'm sorry. But I always worry at the last minute. I don't want people to ever become complacent because then they don't go vote. Over the last few years, I've known many people who have decided to not vote because they feel they don't like their choices. But ultimately, we have to make choices that serve the great good. And we have certainly seen voting change Kentucky forever. Because in 2019, Kentuckians banded together to rid our Commonwealth of Matt Bevin and to elect our current governor, Andrew Scheer. I'm so thankful we did, because if we hadn't, I don't know how many of us would be here tonight. Only 4 months after Bashir was sworn into office, the country was plunged into the most uncertain time in living history, when COVID changed our way of life forever. Again, I'm so thankful that our governor was the one leading us through that. Can you imagine what it would have been like if Bevin had stood in office? Lord have mercy. If those 5,000 people, only 0.37% of the voters that year had stayed home, everything would have been different. Our lives depended on that election. I know that I and many others were comforted by Governor Bashir's empathy during the worst of the pandemic. While others stirred up vitriol and division, our governor focused on being a good neighbor, on selflessness, in a time when so many others blatantly exhibited their selfishness. In his daily updates, Governor Bashir led by example and made all of us safer and calmer in the process. But let me remind you that that election was decided on only 5,086 votes. That was the closest gubernatorial election in Kentucky since 1899 by total votes, and the closest ever by percentage. It was also the closest race of the 2019 gubernatorial election cycle. Again, he won by 0.37 percentage vote points, receiving 49.20% of the vote to Bevin's 48.83%. Bevin won 97 counties, Bashir won 23. Unusually high turnout was cited as the major reason for Bashir's victory. So we have to make sure that we have that unprecedented voter turnout again. It truly illuminated that every vote counts, that our voting does matter. It changed the course of Kentucky history, and in ways far larger than we can even imagine. So we cannot be complacent, and we cannot let others be complacent. To tell you the truth, Governor Scheer being in office is one of the things that has kept me going as Kentuckian over the last few years. He has been a governor who has always led with compassion. He has always been a governor for all Kentuckians. His leadership has given me hope. Remember, in that election, Republicans won all other statewide offices in Kentucky, including the Attorney General and Secretary of State offices, and many of them were leaders in the fight to take away the rights of LGBTQ people and women, to erase the true history of slavery and racism, to demean our public school teachers, to fight against measures that kept us safe during COVID. Everywhere I travel throughout the United States, and even overseas, people ask me about our politics here in Kentucky. They tell me how much they admire our governor, but how hard it is for them to understand many of the other politicians we continue to put in office. I do not understand it, to tell you the truth. But I always remind myself of this: Kentucky is worth fighting for. I am going to keep fighting for it as long as I'm able to do so safely. The first way I will do this is by voting, by encouraging others to vote, by reminding everyone that while we so often feel powerless, that the best thing about voting is having that moment of empowerment in the voting booth. Sometimes, as in the 2019 election, enough of those little moments add up to something that can make our Commonwealth more progressive, more livable, more equal. So never take your vote, your right to vote, for granted. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I want you to carry it to people who might not be in the choir. Never think that your vote doesn't matter. I know that the system is often frustrating. I know that it is wearying to live in a state where you see politicians negate your existence and seek to reduce your rights as human beings. But there is also so much to be proud of in Kentucky. So many of our good people who are fighting the good fight. All of the incredible grassroots work that continues to happen. All of the hard work being done by so many people who are just doing their best and trying to be the best people they can be. They're trying to move through the world while doing the least amount of harm possible. When I think of what I love most about Kentucky, it is always her mountains and pastures, her rivers and creeks, her caves and waterfalls, and cities and town squares and state parks. But most of all, it's Kentuckians that I love the most. I love our many different accents, our foodways, from soup beans to burgoo to bourbon to hot browns. I love our particularities. I love that we say Versailles instead of Versailles. I love that there are arguments over how to say Louisville, but honey, I always say Louisville. I love our rich history, from the Cherokee and Shawnees, the immigrants who are making this place home today. Always, it comes back to the people, for me, to Kentuckians. When I go into that voting booth, I am not just voting for Andy Scheer or Colonel Pam Stevenson or Michael Bowman. I am also voting for my grandmother, who was born in 1909 and once told me about the joy her mother expressed when she finally was given the right to vote. My granny went with my great-grandmother to the voting booth. Granny said she remembered standing in line for a couple of hours with all the other women in Clay County, Kentucky, who were voting for the first time in their lives. I'm also voting for my children to protect their rights. As the product of a 12-year public education, I'm voting for every public school teacher in these states. They do not deserve to be berated. They do not deserve to have more work put on them by laws that are simply political theater and nothing else. I'm voting for my parents, who worked incredibly hard their entire lives to make things better for me, and were protected by unions along the way. I'm voting for those mountains and rivers that I love so much. in the hopes of protecting them by giving power to politicians who seek to preserve them, instead of politicians who will rubber stamp their demise. Mountains that hold forgotten treasures, like rocks covered in prehistoric writing. One of them is in Clay County, Kentucky. Rivers that contain the deepest, coolest, wildest places. When I go into that voting booth, I am voting for Kentucky and Kentuckians because I believe it's worth fighting for. In that essay I mentioned earlier, Bell Hooks wrote that despite the racism she encountered in her childhood, quote, Kentucky hills were where my life began. They represent the place of promise and possibility, end quote. There's so much work to do in Kentucky, but always there is that promise and possibility. In the darkest times, when I'm the most weary, that is what I focus on. And that makes me want to fight harder for it. It makes me matter, and it makes me want to fight harder for it. So join me on Tuesday in voting for our current and next governor, a man who puts people over politics, compassion over division, who wants to move Kentucky forward and not backward.